I'm with Derek Paton. He's the Chief Investment Officer of Nations Royalty. Nations Royalty is not only a new public listing, it's also a new idea, and it's a new way of doing business for integrating public companies and First Nations royalties. So from your perspective, Derek, just kind of run us through Nations from the top down.
It's a new idea, but I would say it's like more of an old idea with a new twist, just because the mining royalty model is very well known, it's very well established, and it takes advantage of the premium valuations that are offered to royalties when they're packaged together instead of being priced individually. So we're going after Indigenous royalties and packaging those together to help create value for Indigenous groups and shareholders, the largest of which will be Indigenous groups.
Gotcha. So explain, I guess, the benefit of transferring traditional royalties, which may be single stream, into a public company where the First Nations are then in turn receiving equity, and kind of how that in the long run is a benefit for these royalty deals.
Right. So I'd say the primary first benefit is to bring value forward. So if you can imagine, you have an annual royalty payment on a mine that could be 10, 20, 30 plus years. The present value of that is actually quite substantial, would certainly dwarf the single annual payment. And so Nations Royalty allows them to bring all that value forward to the present,
Right.
which can really help accelerate economic development or other initiatives they have for their nation. The second aspect to it is also by bringing that value forward to the present and also packaging it with other royalties who have also done the same, it can now capture those more premium valuations, because investors are willing to pay more for a basket of royalties because it lowers the risk to them. And many royalty investors, that's why they're going into a royalty company instead of, say, a pure mining company to begin with, is because they'd like to get exposure to metals, but maybe don't want to have to endure more single asset risks or have to be very careful picking which mining company they choose to buy. They'd like exposure to many different assets. That way, if you have exposure to one asset and there's an unfortunate event, your royalty or equity could go to zero. Whereas if you have exposure to, say, 10 different assets, you're now going to need 10 different separate events, and a lot of them are not correlated, like, say, an underground mine failure in Quebec versus an open pit wall failure in Ontario. They're fundamentally different risks.
Right. And so when investors are looking at companies to invest in, one of the most important things we always talk about is team. And you've got a very interesting and long background in this sector. You spent over 14 years at Canaccord Genuity. Walk us through a little bit of your history, how you got into mining, and the evolution of your career.
Sure. So I was born in Barrie, Ontario. I'm a member of the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte First Nation. I spent the first half of my childhood growing up in Ontario, and my family moved out west and carried on growing up in the Lower Mainland here. I then went to the University of British Columbia. I was pretty good at math growing up as a kid, so that kind of steered me towards engineering. After first year engineering, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but when the people come around and pitch you on the different options to go to, mining, had big trucks, explosives, and I was interested in stocks and investing, didn't know much about it, but mining obviously naturally ties itself to the capital markets pretty quickly because the large capital required to build the projects. So for all those reasons, I ended up going into mining engineering. I graduated, and then I started working at mining investment banking. First started off at Genuity Capital Markets. I worked there for a year, was acquired by Canaccord, and then carried on another 14 years. Most recently finishing up as a director of mining investment banking on a Vancouver team here. And over that time, I spent an unusually high amount of time on mergers and acquisitions specifically, not as much on financings like a more traditional banker might, but very focused on mining acquisitions and the valuations of assets. And royalties, of course, come up all the time through that because they're often on many of the projects you look at, and also worked on some transactions that actually involved the creation of royalties. So a lot of good experience there. And then about a month and a half ago, I stopped doing that and quit that once I saw the IPO press release for Nations Royalty. I thought this was a really neat new idea in the mining space that I wanted to be a part of.
That speaks to you and your...
I'm extremely passionate about it for sure. It's, I've loving the team I'm working with and we're having lots of fun, but there's definitely an extra incentive to do a good job and work hard and really grow this company and turn it into something special.
So a decade and a half of experience doing M&A for a large brokerage firm. There's a lot of lessons that are learned over time like that. What are, I guess, like in hindsight, now that you're sort of on the public side, what are some of the big lessons that you took away from all of that time?
Obviously purchase price is a big one in mergers and acquisition, and what's a sensible purchase price that can work for both parties. Because if it doesn't work it might work for one in the short term, but then it doesn't work in the long term if, say, like the equity doesn't perform well.
Right.
Right. It happens all the time in mining M&A where they advertise, here's your X% premium offer, but right after announcement, it can quickly deteriorate if the market doesn't love the deal.
Right.
So you want to do some smart deals. The different types of offer consideration come into that too. That's something we'll be exploring with all of our transactions. Is with the Nisga'a Nation, our founding nation, it was a 100% share deal, and that made sense for them. But every nation is going to be unique and different. It's going to depend on what their assets are, what their needs for cash are, and we're ultimately offering a financial product. So we're happy to be flexible and work with them to do what will work for them for their cash needs. Like example would be if they're already owning a cash flowing asset, we can put a small amount of cash consideration in there that might represent the next 2, 3, 4 years of cash flow, so that they're not deprived of that cash flow in the short term.
Right.
Things like that, I guess. There's a lot to cover in 15 years of mergers and acquisitions, but that's the quick gist, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. And that acknowledgement that a lot of deals can fall apart because the valuation falls off after the deal's announced. Evaluating mining companies is something that's incredibly difficult, especially when they're at different stages, evaluating the asset. Nations Royalties sort of come up with their own system for evaluating assets, evaluating projects, and you are applying NAV to these different projects. Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit and how you guys are approaching the valuations here?
Right, so it depends on what the royalty type is. In some sense, it can be a lot more simple than looking at a corporate, like company A buys company B transaction where you have a whole share capital structure and balance sheet to go through as well and figure out what's hiding in there.
Yeah.
So these will be more at the project level. So in that sense, it's simpler. And in the Indigenous space right now, there's a range of different assets out there. There's NSRs, which are traditionally called like a top line royalty. There's some bottom lines like NPIs, net profit interests.
Yeah.
And with our current portfolio of 5 royalty assets on 4 mines, or 2 mines and 2 projects, we have a mixture of NSRs, net smelter return royalties, and something we call like an MTR, a mineral tax royalty, which is something between a top line and a bottom line, because essentially the royalty is paid out on 2 different margins. One that's applied to revenue minus operating costs.
Okay.
And then once the capital is paid back at the mine, then the second phase of the royalty kicks in.
So I see like a big part of the value here that Nations Royalties can be bringing to First Nations is some of that expertise when it comes to negotiating these types of deals, is explaining, because it's not an easy language if you don't know it. So
for sure.
I guess can you speak to that benefit a little bit of that partnership?
Absolutely. I mean, we would very much love to be involved in that sort of process, especially since Nations Royalty now changes that dynamic quite a bit, because before Nations Royalty, the miner can only part with so much net asset value in any one of those transactions. Right. And there maybe isn't a preference for one type of royalty structure over another, because if you were just planning on receiving the check, that maybe isn't a major consideration. But the truth is that some types of royalties, even though it's the same net asset value, are worth much, much more. Right. Like you could have, 3 different royalties that are worth 50 million NAV, but the amount that an investor would be willing to pay for that might be only, say, 40 million. If it's more marketable, maybe 70 million. Right. And on the top end of royalty valuations, like the very top, trade at 2 times, so that sort of asset could be worth $100 million. So that's kind of something new that I think will come into the impact and benefit agreement space, and we'd very much love to help work for different Indigenous groups to help them negotiate those and get them the biggest piece of the pie we can. Right.
And now, walking back to discuss sort of the share structure of Nations Royalty, 76% owned currently by the Nisga'a Nation. You guys did a financing before you went public. Can you kind of walk us through, I guess, share structure and how much money you've raised and kind of forecasting revenue streams?
Right. So Nisga'a Nation being our founding shareholder, and the Indigenous group we partnered with, who've contributed the assets to begin the company, they're roughly a 3/4 shareholder right now. And then we also raised Canadian $10 million in an IPO to fund the company and to get it going. And then the remaining interest is owned by the Fiore Group and management team, who were the capital markets team that would, combined with the Nisga'a Nation, were the two groups to really help get this idea going.
Right.
As for revenue projections, I'd recommend someone look at our corporate presentation. There's a lot more detail in there. But at a super high level, starting in 2025, I think it's the first 4 years after that or so, it's revenues around US $10 million, $9 million, somewhere around there. And then with KSM kicking in, it's a large development stage copper gold project, the largest in the world that's permitted, yet undeveloped. Then it can grow up to, I believe it's around 50 million US when it first kicks in.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of growth in our pipeline already. We're actually very fortunate where for a starter kit royalty with One Nation, it's got a nice mixture of, 2 revenue generating assets and then 2 projects, one of which is enormous and worth a lot. The public company behind KSM is Seabridge Gold, so someone can look that up. It's a multi-billion-dollar market cap. It's a huge project with tens of millions of ounces and billions of pounds of copper.
Definitely a great story. And then when it comes to building out these partnerships and bringing more nations into Nations Royalty, the model is to continue issuing shares, or how does that relationship unfold?
Say predominantly shares. I would say, we would like them to be partners with us and to actually receive the benefit of the re-rating, the more premium re-rating for royalty companies.
Right.
So we would encourage them to take a greater percentage of the transaction in shares for sure. But again, a small cash component might be part of that, but it's going to differ on every single deal. Everyone's going to be unique, so we really need to be deeper into discussions to help figure out what's going to work for them.
Yes.
But I would like to see more Indigenous shareholders with strong share ownership positions. So that way, by growing the share price, we make them money. Help improve the lives of their community and their nations. So.
Right. And so you do come from a Mohawk background. You are connected to this earth. And I guess sometimes it can be very hard to just truly understand cultural differences unless you've really dove in and really experienced someone else's way of living. So from a cultural perspective, what do you think maybe some investors how could we enlighten them about the way of doing business when it becomes, stewards of a land, resource management, and engaging in this type of business?
Right. That's a tough question because it's hard for me just to speak on behalf of someone's whole culture, even though I'm a part of it. I would say a key aspect, which is more common now in mining, is just that for those projects to go ahead in the permitting process, the consent of that local Indigenous group is very important.
Yeah.
They need to feel like and make sure that they're getting treated fairly and properly in that process, and that they're being consulted, and that any issues they raise are being listened to and being addressed. I guess that's all I'd quickly say about that. There'd be a lot more you could talk about, but.
And as well, you're an interesting territory that you're founding on with the Nisga'a bordering on the Paton, and I think part of the other understanding, Western eyes really see things as strict and hard, fast lines, and territories don't always have distinct lines. There's blending.
Absolutely.
And for example, the Bruce Jack mine, there's 2 royalties on there, one for Paton, one for Nisga'a. So it's an important piece to understand when engaging in these conversations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of Indigenous royalties out there for that reason.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much. There's going to be a lot of updates, I'm sure, as quarterly reports come out. And the Chief Investment Officer, you are going to have your hands very full, I'm sure, because it sounds like there's a lot of things coming down the pipe. So very excited to hear about this, very excited to share the story, and thank you for spending the time with me.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.